The autumn wind carried the acrid smell of smoke across the Nebraska plains on that fateful October evening in 2023. Harold Brennan stood motionless in his gravel driveway, watching nearly a century of family history go up in flames. The red barn that had housed 3 generations of Brennan livestock and equipment was now a towering inferno against the darkening sky. Harold's weathered hands trembled as he clutched his cell phone, the emergency dispatcher's voice barely audible over the roar of the flames. At 72 years old, he had seen his share of farm accidents, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. The barn wasn't just burning. It was being consumed with an almost supernatural intensity that seemed to defy explanation. Harold had built his entire life around that barn. His earliest memories included helping his father feed cattle on frigid winter mornings, learning to operate farm equipment under his grandfather's watchful supervision, and spending countless hours repairing machinery beneath the timber beams that were now turning to ash. The first fire truck arrived from Millbrook's volunteer department within 20 minutes, followed quickly by units from 2 neighboring counties. Captain Steve Morrison, a 20-year veteran of rural firefighting, had never seen a structure fire burn with such ferocity. The flames reached nearly 50 feet into the air, visible from miles away across the flat farmland. Morrison had fought barn fires before. They were notoriously dangerous due to the combination of dry hay, equipment fuel, and old wooden structures. But this fire was different. It burned too hot, too fast, as if something had been used to accelerate the flames. His experience told him this was no ordinary accidental fire. As the firefighters worked through the night, neighbors began arriving. The farming community of Millbrook was tight-knit, and when one of their own faced disaster, everyone rallied together. Sarah Chen, who owned the adjacent property, brought coffee and sandwiches for the emergency responders. Tom and Martha Williams, whose family had farmed alongside the Brennans for 40 years, stood quietly with Harold, offering what comfort they could. Sarah Chen had grown up on the neighboring farm, daughter of Taiwanese immigrants who had found their place in the American farming community through hard work and determination. She had known Harold since childhood, remembering him as a gentle man who always had time for a friendly word or to help a neighbor in need. Seeing his property being destroyed this way broke her heart. Tom Williams, for his part, carried even deeper memories. He and Harold had grown up together, attended the same one-room rural school, learned to drive in the same dusty fields. They had been best friends for decades, sharing joys and sorrows, good harvest years and difficult years when droughts threatened to destroy everything they had worked for. But Harold remained strangely distant throughout the ordeal. While others wept for the loss of such a historic structure, he stood with an expression that seemed almost relieved. When Martha Williams placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, she noticed he was trembling, not from the October chill, but from something deeper, something that seemed to come from within. Martha had known Harold since she married Tom in 1978. She had watched him marry his beloved wife Ruth, raise their 3 children, and face the devastation when Ruth lost her battle with a terrible illness 5 years earlier. Throughout all those years, Harold had been a rock, stable, reliable, always ready to help others in times of need. But tonight, something was different. There was a tension in him she had never seen before. Reverend Michael O'Sullivan from Millbrook Methodist Church arrived around midnight, knowing his presence would be needed during a crisis like this. He had served the community for 15 years and knew every family, every story, every joy and tragedy that had shaped their lives. Harold had been one of the pillars of his congregation, a man whose faith seemed unshakable even during the most difficult times. But when O'Sullivan approached Harold to offer words of comfort and prayer, he was met with a reaction that surprised him. Harold physically stepped away, avoiding eye contact, muttering only that he was fine and didn't need anything. It was as if the Reverend's presence was somehow disturbing to him, a reaction completely out of character for a man who traditionally found strength in faith. By dawn, the fire was finally extinguished, leaving behind a skeleton of charred timber and twisted metal. The barn that had weathered dust storms, tornadoes, and decades of harsh Nebraska winters was now nothing more than a pile of smoking ruins. The investigation would begin soon, but first the debris needed to cool enough for the fire marshal to safely examine the scene. Dr. James Fletcher, the town doctor who also served as county coroner, arrived the next morning to document the scene. Fletcher had taken on these dual responsibilities because Millbrook was too small to justify dedicated officials for each function. In his 20 years in this role, he had investigated several farm fires, but few had resulted in the complete destruction he witnessed at the Brennan barn. As Fletcher and Morrison walked the perimeter of the debris, they noticed several anomalies. The burn pattern suggested the fire had started at multiple points simultaneously, something unusual for accidental fires. There was also evidence that flammable materials had been strategically placed to accelerate the spread of flames. Morrison had seen enough in his career to recognize the signs of arson when he saw them. The spread patterns, the intensity of the fire, and the complete destruction of the structure all pointed to intentional ignition. But who would do such a thing, and why? Harold Brennan was respected by everyone in the community. He had no known enemies, no serious financial disputes, no apparent reason for anyone to want to destroy his property. 3 days later, Fire Marshal Janet Rodriguez arrived with her team to begin the painstaking process of determining the fire's cause. Rodriguez had investigated hundreds of structure fires throughout her career, and she approached each case with methodical precision. She began her examination at the barn's northeast corner, where witnesses reported seeing the first flames. Rodriguez was a 25-year veteran of the State Fire Department, specializing in fire investigation. She had seen everything, from simple electrical equipment accidents to complex insurance fraud cases involving elaborate arson. Her reputation for attention to detail and careful analysis had made her the preferred investigator for challenging cases throughout the state. As Rodriguez and her team carefully sifted through the debris, they documented everything: the burn patterns on the remaining timber, the melted remnants of farm equipment, and the way the fire had spread through the structure. It was tedious work, made more challenging by the barn's complete destruction. The debris told a story to those trained to read it. The wooden beams showed char patterns that indicated specific directions of fire spread. The remains of metal equipment revealed the extreme temperatures that had been reached. Each piece of evidence was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed to build a complete picture of how the fire had behaved. On the second day of the investigation, Rodriguez made a discovery that would change everything. While examining the central area of the barn's foundation, her team uncovered something that shouldn't have been there, something that had been hidden beneath the floorboards for what appeared to be many years. The discovery was carefully documented and photographed before being removed from the scene. Rodriguez immediately contacted the county sheriff's department, knowing that her investigation had just taken a dramatic turn. What had begun as a routine fire investigation was now something far more serious. Rodriguez had developed a sixth sense over the years about when an investigation was about to become something bigger. There were subtle signs: the way people behaved, small inconsistencies in stories, physical evidence that didn't fit normal patterns. This investigation had shown several of those signs from the beginning. When she discovered the human remains, Rodriguez felt a familiar mixture of professional satisfaction and personal sadness. Satisfaction because her methodical investigation had uncovered crucial evidence that could finally bring justice for someone. Sadness because this discovery meant that a family, somewhere, had lost a loved one long ago and might finally have answers. Sheriff David Patterson arrived at the scene within an hour of Rodriguez's call. Patterson had served as sheriff of Cedar County for 15 years, and he had seen his share of unusual cases. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for what the fire marshal showed him in the ruins of Harold Brennan's barn. Patterson had grown up on a farm just a few miles from the Brennan property. He had known Harold since childhood, remembered playing baseball against him in local youth leagues, seeing him at church every Sunday with his family. The idea that Harold could be involved in something sinister was almost unthinkable, but the evidence was right before his eyes. Carefully preserved in evidence bags were human remains, bones that had clearly been there for a long time. The condition and placement of the remains suggested they had been deliberately concealed beneath the barn's floor, hidden away from the world for decades. Patterson's first instinct was to secure the scene and call in additional resources. Within hours, the Nebraska State Police Crime Scene Unit was on site, along with a forensic anthropologist from the University of Nebraska. The quiet farming community of Millbrook suddenly found itself at the center of a major criminal investigation. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the forensic anthropologist, began her examination of the remains that same afternoon. Harper was considered one of the best in her field, with over 15 years of experience analyzing ancient remains. She had worked on cases ranging from Native American archaeological sites to modern criminal investigations. Her initial assessment suggested the bones belonged to a young adult, probably in their 20s, who had been deceased for at least 20 to 30 years. The cause of death couldn't be immediately determined, but the deliberate concealment of the body strongly suggested foul play. Harper had developed a systematic methodology for analyzing ancient remains. She always started with basic determinations: age, sex, ancestry when possible, and approximate time since death. Then she looked for evidence of trauma, disease, or other conditions that might indicate the cause of death. The bones she was examining told a tragic story. The individual had been young and apparently healthy at the time of death. There was no evidence of chronic disease or previous injury, but there were disturbing signs of acute trauma that suggested violence. As news of the discovery spread through Millbrook, the community was gripped by a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Who were these remains? How long had they been hidden beneath the Brennan barn? And most importantly, who was responsible for placing them there? The discovery shook the community to its core. Millbrook was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where everyone knew everyone else, where violent crime was practically unheard of. The idea that someone had been eliminated and hidden right under their noses for decades was deeply disturbing. At Millbrook's general store, which served as the unofficial gossip center of town, conversations revolved exclusively around the discovery. Eleanor Matthews, who had run the store for 30 years, had never seen the community so agitated. People came not just to buy groceries, but to share theories and speculations about what might have happened. Some residents recalled people who had disappeared over the years, seasonal workers who had left without notice, young people who had left town seeking better opportunities, visitors who had passed through the area and were never seen again. Each memory was examined and re-examined for clues about the victim's identity. Harold Brennan's behavior during the investigation raised immediate questions. When Sheriff Patterson approached him for an interview, Harold's demeanor had changed dramatically from the night of the fire. His strange sense of relief had disappeared. Now he appeared nervous, agitated, and reluctant to answer even basic questions about his property's history. Patterson had known Harold for most of his life. Millbrook was a small community where everyone knew everyone else. Harold had always been considered a pillar of the community, a hard-working farmer who had never caused trouble for anyone. But now, faced with the discovery on his property, Harold seemed like a completely different person. The transformation in Harold was noticeable to anyone who knew him well. Tom Williams, who had been his closest friend for decades, commented to his wife that Harold seemed to have aged 10 years in a few days. He avoided eye contact, spoke in hushed, hesitant tones, and seemed to be constantly looking over his shoulder, as if expecting something terrible to happen. Martha Williams, always perceptive about people's behavior, noticed that Harold had begun avoiding public places entirely. He didn't show up at church the Sunday following the discovery, something unprecedented for a man who had rarely missed a service in decades. He also stopped going to the general store for his daily morning coffee, a tradition he had maintained for years. Dr. Fletcher, in his capacity as town doctor, had noticed signs of extreme stress in Harold for years. As a small-town physician, Fletcher knew not just the physical health of his patients, but often became aware of their emotional problems as well. Harold had shown signs of chronic anxiety, insomnia, and what appeared to be depression for a long time. Fletcher had always attributed these symptoms to the stress of farming and grief over Ruth's death. Farmers faced constant financial pressures, weather concerns, and the physically demanding nature of their work. And losing a wife after 45 years of marriage was certainly traumatic enough to explain ongoing mental health issues. But now, in light of the discovery in the barn, Fletcher began to wonder if there had been something deeper troubling Harold. He mentally reviewed years of medical consultations, recalling how Harold often seemed distracted, anxious, as if he were carrying an invisible burden he could never put down. The investigation expanded as detectives began looking into missing persons cases from the past 30 years. The remains would need to be sent to the state crime lab for more detailed analysis, including DNA testing that might help identify the victim. But that process would take weeks, and the community was demanding answers. Detective Marcus Rodriguez, no relation to the fire marshal, was assigned to lead the criminal investigation. Rodriguez was a 15-year veteran of the Nebraska State Police, specializing in cold homicide cases. He had solved several seemingly impossible cases through meticulous detective work and modern scientific analysis. Rodriguez approached the case with the methodology he had perfected throughout his career. First, establish a timeline of the discovery and surrounding circumstances. Second, identify all possible suspects and witnesses. Third, search for missing persons cases that might match the remains. Fourth, build a theory of the case based on physical evidence and testimony. Local historian Margaret Foster volunteered to help by researching the barn's history. The structure had been built by Harold's grandfather, William Brennan, in 1923. It had been in continuous use by the family ever since, primarily for storing hay and housing cattle. Margaret's research revealed that the barn had undergone several renovations over the decades, including a complete flooring replacement in 1987. Margaret Foster had been Millbrook's librarian for 40 years before retiring, and she maintained a passionate interest in local history. Her research was meticulous, tracking property records, building permits, and even old photographs that showed the evolution of the barn over time. The timing of that renovation caught Sheriff Patterson's attention. If the remains had been placed under the floor during the 1987 renovation, it would narrow down the time frame considerably. More importantly, it would mean that Harold Brennan himself might have been involved in their concealment. The discovery of the 1987 records was a pivotal moment in the investigation. Not only did it provide a specific time frame, but it also revealed that Harold had personally financed the barn renovation, paying cash for materials and labor. For a farmer who often struggled with financial pressures, such a large expenditure seemed unusual. Margaret also discovered something interesting in the local newspaper archives. In the fall of 1987, there had been several articles about farm equipment theft in the area. Various farmers had reported tractors, implements, and other expensive machinery disappearing from their properties. Police had never solved these crimes, and eventually the cases went cold. Patterson decided to interview Harold more formally, this time at the sheriff's department. Harold arrived with his attorney, a development that surprised many in the community who had known him as an honest, straightforward man. The interview lasted several hours, but few details were released to the public. During the interview, Harold remained largely silent, allowing his attorney, Robert Chen, Sarah Chen's older brother, to answer most questions. Robert had returned to Nebraska after years of practicing law in Omaha, establishing a small office to serve the rural community where he had grown up. Robert Chen immediately recognized that his client was in serious trouble. Harold's body language, his reluctance to discuss the period in question, and the circumstances of the discovery painted a concerning picture. As an attorney, Robert needed to protect Harold's interests, but as a community member, he also wanted the truth. The interview revealed several inconsistencies in Harold's account of events. He initially claimed not to remember many details about the barn renovation in 1987, but when pressed with specific records and receipts, his memory seemed to improve selectively. He also showed extreme anxiety when questioned about workers he had employed during that period. Meanwhile, Dr. Harper continued her analysis of the remains. She was able to determine that the victim had been male, approximately 25 years old at the time of death. Several of the bones showed signs of trauma, suggesting violence had been involved. Most significantly, she found evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull that would likely have been fatal. Harper's analysis was meticulous and scientific. Using advanced forensic anthropology techniques, she was able to reconstruct not just the circumstances of death, but also details about the victim's life. Marks on the bones indicated heavy physical work, consistent with agricultural or construction labor. The condition of the teeth suggested someone who had not had regular access to dental care, possibly indicating lower socioeconomic background. The revelation that the death appeared to be a homicide sent shockwaves through Millbrook. The community had always prided itself on being a safe, peaceful place, where violent crime was virtually unknown. The idea that someone had been eliminated and hidden beneath one of their neighbors' barns for decades was almost incomprehensible. Reverend O'Sullivan organized several community meetings to help residents process the trauma of the discovery. Many people felt shaken in their sense of safety and trust. If something like this could happen in Millbrook, if someone they knew and respected could be capable of such violence, what else didn't they know about their own community? As the investigation continued, detectives began interviewing longtime residents about any missing persons from the 1980s and early 1990s. Several names emerged from their inquiries, but one stood out in particular: Michael Torres, a 24-year-old migrant worker who had disappeared from the area in 1987. Torres had come to Nebraska that summer to work the harvest season, as many young men did during those years. He had been employed by several farms in the area, including Harold Brennan's. According to the few records that still existed, Torres had been last seen in late September 1987, around the time the barn renovation was taking place. The connection was circumstantial but compelling. Torres fit the profile of the remains in terms of age and time frame. More importantly, his disappearance had never been thoroughly investigated. As a migrant worker with no local family, Torres had simply been assumed to have moved on to other work elsewhere. Detective Rodriguez began searching for more information about Michael Torres. Immigration records showed he had entered the United States legally with an agricultural work visa. He had worked farms in Texas and Colorado before arriving in Nebraska. By all accounts, he was a reliable, respectful worker who sent most of his earnings back to his family in Mexico. The search for information about Torres led Rodriguez to an important discovery. Torres had had a girlfriend during his time in Nebraska, a young woman named Maria Santos who had worked at a local restaurant. Maria had left Nebraska shortly after Torres's disappearance, but Rodriguez was able to locate her through Social Security records. The breakthrough came when detectives located Maria Santos, Torres's girlfriend from 1987. Maria had left Nebraska shortly after Torres's disappearance, but she had never forgotten him or stopped wondering what had happened. Now living in Colorado with a family of her own, Maria agreed to speak with investigators about the events of that autumn 36 years ago. Maria Santos, now Maria Santos Rodriguez, had built a good life for herself in Colorado. She had married a gentle carpenter, raised 3 children, and ran a small clothing store in Pueblo's Hispanic community. But she had never forgotten Michael Torres, her first love, the young man who had disappeared from her life so mysteriously. When Rodriguez contacted her, Maria felt a mixture of hope and terror. Hope that she might finally have answers about what had happened to Michael. Terror that those answers might confirm her worst fears about his fate. Maria's account painted a disturbing picture of Torres's final weeks. She described how he had become increasingly worried about something at the Brennan farm, though he had been vague about the details. Torres had mentioned seeing something he shouldn't have seen, something that had made Harold Brennan very angry. According to Maria, Torres had started working for Harold at the beginning of summer 1987. Initially, the work had been good. Harold paid fairly and on time, and the work was typical farm labor, tending cattle, repairing fences, helping with equipment. Michael had liked the consistency after months of inconsistent seasonal work elsewhere. But in late August, something had changed. Michael began coming home tense and distracted. When Maria asked what was wrong, he would only say there were problems at the Brennan farm. He had become reluctant to discuss his work, something unusual for a young man who was typically open about his experiences. According to Maria, Torres had been planning to leave Nebraska earlier than originally intended. He was scared, she said, though he wouldn't explain why. The last time she saw him, he was heading to the Brennan farm to collect his final paycheck. He never returned. Maria vividly remembered that last conversation. Michael had been unusually serious, almost solemn. He had talked about saving enough money to bring his mother from Mexico to the United States, about building a better life for his family. He had spoken about the future with an intensity that had impressed her at the time, but now seemed prophetic. She also remembered that Michael had mentioned seeing Harold moving equipment at night, equipment that he didn't recognize as belonging to the Brennan farm. When Michael asked about it, Harold had become defensive and angry, telling Michael to focus on his own work. Maria's testimony provided the missing piece of the puzzle. Torres had witnessed something incriminating involving Harold Brennan, and Brennan had eliminated him to protect his secret. The barn renovation had provided the perfect opportunity to conceal the evidence of his crime. Armed with this new information, Rodriguez obtained a warrant to search Harold Brennan's house and remaining outbuildings. The search turned up additional evidence, including old photographs and documents that confirmed Torres had worked on the farm during the summer of 1987. The search of the house revealed an impeccably maintained home, but with subtle signs of Harold's emotional isolation. There were few personal photographs displayed, few signs of active social life. The house seemed more like a museum than a home, preserved exactly as it had been when Ruth was alive, but lacking the life and energy she had brought. More significantly, detectives found Harold's journal from that period. The entries from September 1987 revealed a man under tremendous stress, worried about problems that needed to be taken care of permanently. The final entry, dated September 28, 1987, simply read, "It's done. God forgive me." The discovery of the journal was a breakthrough moment in the investigation. Not only did it provide documentary evidence of Harold's state of mind during the period in question, but it also offered a specific timeline for the events. The September 28th entry corresponded exactly with the last day Michael Torres had been seen alive. Rodriguez noted that the journal entries after September 28th changed dramatically in tone. Where previous entries had shown worry and anxiety about specific problems, later entries showed a man consumed by guilt and fear. Harold wrote about nightmares, insomnia, and a constant fear of discovery. Faced with mounting evidence, Harold Brennan's attorney advised him to cooperate with investigators. In a lengthy confession, Harold finally revealed the truth about what had happened that autumn night 36 years ago. Harold's confession was videotaped at the sheriff's department with his attorney present. It was a painful process, both for Harold and for those who heard his account of events. This was a man who had carried a terrible secret for more than 3 decades, and finally speaking about it seemed both a relief and a torture. According to Harold's account, Michael Torres had accidentally witnessed him moving stolen farm equipment through the barn late one evening. Harold had been struggling financially and had resorted to stealing and reselling machinery from neighboring farms. It was a crime that could have ruined his reputation and sent him to prison. The confession revealed that the equipment theft had started small. Harold had initially taken only minor items, tools, spare parts, things that might not be missed immediately. But as his financial pressures grew, he escalated to larger and more valuable machinery. Harold described how he had developed a system for moving stolen equipment through his property during the night, using his barn as a temporary stopping point before transporting the items to buyers in other counties. It was an operation that had worked well for months until Michael Torres accidentally stumbled upon it. When Torres threatened to report what he had seen unless Harold paid him to keep quiet, Harold panicked. In a moment of rage and desperation, he struck Torres with a heavy wrench, intending only to knock him unconscious. But the blow was fatal, and Harold suddenly found himself with a dead body on his hands. Harold vividly remembered the moment when he realized Torres was dead. The panic he had felt was unlike anything he had experienced before or since. He had struck the young man in a moment of anger, but had never intended to kill him. The reality of what he had done descended upon him like a crushing wave. Terrified of the consequences, Harold decided to conceal the crime. He buried Torres's body in a shallow grave behind the barn, then spent the next several weeks planning how to hide the evidence permanently. When he decided to renovate the barn's flooring later that year, he saw an opportunity to move the body to a location where it would never be found. The process of moving the body had been a traumatic ordeal that Harold had never forgotten. He had waited for a moonless night, carefully exhumed the remains, and transported them inside the barn. Then he had dug a new burial site directly under where the new flooring would be installed. Harold had personally financed the barn renovation, doing the work himself whenever possible to minimize the number of people who might discover what was hidden beneath the floorboards. It was a period of extreme anxiety, working over the burial site, knowing that at any moment someone might discover his terrible secret. Harold's confession revealed a man who had been consumed by overwhelming guilt for more than 3 decades. The weight of his secret had affected his relationships with family and friends. He had become increasingly isolated, unable to form close connections with others for fear of revealing what he had done. Harold admitted that his wife Ruth had noticed changes in him after 1987. She had repeatedly asked if something was wrong, if he was facing problems they needed to discuss. But Harold could never bring himself to tell her the truth. The secret had become a barrier between them that he was never able to tear down. The guilt had manifested in physical ways as well. Harold developed chronic insomnia, often waking from nightmares about that terrible night. He began avoiding the barn whenever possible, finding excuses to keep cattle elsewhere, store equipment in different structures. The fire that destroyed the barn, Harold admitted, had not been accidental. Facing mounting financial pressures and the constant fear of discovery, he had decided to burn down the structure that held his darkest secret. But the plan had backfired spectacularly, ultimately leading to the very discovery he had tried to prevent. Harold described planning the fire as an act of desperation. At 72 years old, he knew he didn't have much time left, and the idea of taking his secret to the grave had become an obsession. He believed that if he could completely destroy the barn, any remaining evidence would be destroyed with it. On the night of the fire, Harold had waited until he was certain no neighbors were around. He had used gasoline and other accelerants to ensure the fire would burn hot enough to destroy any remaining evidence. In his mind, if the barn were completely destroyed, his secret would be safe forever. But Harold had underestimated the thoroughness of modern fire investigators. He hadn't realized that complete destruction of the structure would itself be suspicious, or that modern forensic techniques could uncover evidence even in severely burned debris. Harold Brennan was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and concealment of a homicide. At his age, and given the decades that had passed since the crime, it was unlikely he would ever be released from prison. The man who had once been respected throughout Millbrook now faced spending his final years behind bars. Harold's arrest sent even greater shockwaves through the community. Many residents struggled to reconcile the Harold Brennan they had known with the man capable of such violence. The case forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that even in their close-knit community, dark secrets could remain hidden for decades. Tom Williams, Harold's closest friend, was particularly devastated by the revelation. He blamed himself for not noticing signs of what Harold was going through, for not being the kind of friend who could have helped Harold find a different way to deal with his problems. Martha Williams struggled with memories of all the years she had known Harold, searching for signs she had missed. There had been moments over the years when Harold had seemed particularly distracted or anxious, but she had attributed them to the normal stresses of farm life. Sarah Chen felt betrayed in a way she had difficulty articulating. Harold had been like a second father to her growing up, a gentle man who always had time for a curious child. Discovering that he was capable of violence and deception made her question her own ability to judge people's character. The identification of the remains was confirmed through DNA analysis several weeks later. Michael Torres's family in Mexico was finally able to learn what had happened to their son, who had disappeared so many years ago. His body was returned to them for proper burial, bringing closure to a mystery that had haunted them for decades. The confirmation of identity brought both relief and renewed grief to the Torres family. Michael's mother, now an elderly woman, had spent 36 years hoping her son would come home. Part of her had always hoped he was alive somewhere, that he had simply been unable to contact them. Michael's younger brother, who had been just a child when Michael disappeared, had grown up with his brother's absence as a constant presence in his life. He had become a lawyer in Mexico, partially motivated by a desire to find justice for his missing brother. The process of repatriating Michael's body to Mexico was complicated, involving multiple government agencies and non-profit organizations that help families in such situations. But the Millbrook community rallied to help, raising funds to cover the costs and ensure Michael could finally come home. For the community of Millbrook, the revelation was deeply troubling. Many residents struggled to reconcile the Harold Brennan they had known with the man capable of such violence. The case forced them to confront the uncomfortable reality that even in their close-knit community, dark secrets could remain hidden for decades. Harold Brennan's trial was held the following spring. Due to his age and declining health, the court allowed him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for a man his age. During the sentencing hearing, Harold made a public statement apologizing to Michael Torres's family and the Millbrook community. His words were widely considered sincere, but also too late to make any real difference to those who had been hurt by his actions. The Torres family established a scholarship fund in Michael's memory to help other young migrant workers pursue education and better opportunities. They wanted to ensure that their son's death would ultimately lead to something positive, a way to prevent other young people from facing the desperation that had led to his tragic end. Sarah Chen, Harold's neighbor, purchased the Brennan property at auction and had the barn's foundation completely removed. In its place, she planted a memorial garden with a simple stone marker remembering Michael Torres and all those who work the fields to feed America. The garden became a place of reflection for the community, a reminder of the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. The creation of the memorial garden was a collaborative project that brought the community together in unexpected ways. Residents who had never worked side by side found themselves planting flowers and trees together, sharing stories, and processing the collective trauma they had all experienced. The garden was designed to be a space for healing and reflection. Different sections represented different aspects of Michael's life: his love for his family, his hope for the future, and his dignity as a human being. A special section was dedicated to all the migrant workers who had contributed to the farming community over the years. Sheriff Patterson retired shortly after the case was closed, citing the emotional toll of investigating a crime that had remained hidden in plain sight for so long. The case had taught him that justice, while sometimes delayed, would eventually prevail. The truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when least expected. Patterson had spent his entire career believing he knew his community, that he understood the people he had grown up with. The Brennan case had shaken that belief to its core, forcing him to recognize that even those we think we know best are capable of hiding terrible secrets. At his retirement ceremony, Patterson spoke about the lessons he had learned from the case. He emphasized the importance of treating all people with dignity regardless of their background or status, and the need to remain vigilant against injustice even in seemingly peaceful communities. Dr. Harper, the forensic anthropologist, made her analysis of the Torres case the subject of several academic papers, highlighting the importance of preserving evidence even in cases where immediate identification seems impossible. Her work on the Torres case helped advance techniques for analyzing aged remains and contributed to solving several other cold cases across the country. Harper's work demonstrated how modern forensic science could bring justice even decades after a crime had been committed. Her techniques for analyzing degraded remains and determining cause of death in old cases became a model for investigators nationwide. She also spoke extensively about the importance of treating human remains with dignity and respect, regardless of the circumstances of their discovery. For Harper, each set of remains represented a human life that deserved to be remembered and honored. Maria Santos found peace in finally knowing what had happened to Michael. She testified at Harold's sentencing hearing, not to seek revenge, but to ensure that her lost love was remembered as the kind, hard-working young man he had been. Her testimony helped the court understand the full impact of Harold's crime, not just on Michael, but on all those who had loved him. Maria spoke about the years of uncertainty she had endured, never knowing if Michael was alive or dead, whether he had simply chosen to leave, or if something terrible had happened. The knowledge, while painful, was better than the uncertainty she had carried for decades. She also spoke about the man Michael had been, his dreams of bringing his family to the United States, his work ethic, his kindness to everyone he met. Maria wanted the court to understand that Michael wasn't just a victim, but a complete person with hopes and dreams that had been brutally cut short. The Brennan family farm was eventually sold to a young couple just starting their agricultural careers. They were aware of the property's history but chose to see it as an opportunity to create something positive from tragedy. They specialized in organic farming and hired several migrant workers each season, always ensuring fair wages and safe working conditions. The new owner, James Murphy, and his wife Lisa, saw the property not as a place haunted by the past, but as a place where they could make a difference. They implemented farming practices that were both environmentally sustainable and socially responsible. The Murphys made it a point to learn about Michael Torres and the property's history. They planted a special tree in his memory and always took time to explain his story to new workers, ensuring he was remembered and honored. They also worked closely with worker rights organizations to ensure all their employees were treated fairly. This included providing adequate housing, basic health care, and educational opportunities for those interested. As the seasons passed and the community slowly healed, the memorial garden became a gathering place for reflection and remembrance. School children learned about Michael Torres and the importance of speaking up when they witnessed wrongdoing. The tragedy became a teaching moment about the consequences of allowing fear and greed to overcome moral responsibility. The garden included educational plaques that told Michael's story and spoke about the contributions of migrant workers to American agriculture. School groups frequently visited as part of their lessons about local history and social responsibility. A special section of the garden was dedicated to all people who had disappeared or been victims of violence, a reminder that justice may be delayed but must not be denied. The garden became a symbol of the community's ability to face difficult truths and work toward healing. Harold Brennan died in prison 2 years after his conviction, taking with him the full details of that terrible night in 1987. But his confession had provided enough closure for those who needed it most. Michael Torres was no longer a forgotten victim. He was remembered, honored, and his story served as a powerful reminder of the value of every human life. Harold's final days in prison were reported to be spent in contemplation and repentance. He had finally found some measure of peace in having confessed his crime and asked for forgiveness, even though it was too late to make any real difference to those he had hurt. Prison officials noted that Harold had become a model prisoner, helping other inmates with their education and serving as a counselor to younger men struggling with their own decisions. It was as if finally telling the truth had released something in him that had been trapped for decades. The prison chaplain who worked with Harold reported that he had spent much time writing letters to the Torres family, though none were sent at the family's request. Harold seemed to be trying to find words to express a remorse that was too deep for language. The fire that had been intended to hide a terrible secret had instead brought it to light, proving that even the most carefully concealed truths cannot remain hidden forever. In the end, the case served as a profound lesson about the corrosive power of guilt and the ultimate triumph of justice, even when it arrives decades late. The investigation also led to changes in how missing persons cases were handled in the county. New protocols were established to ensure that disappearances were taken seriously, regardless of the missing person's status or background. A database was created to track migrant workers and ensure their whereabouts were monitored for their own protection. This included regular check-ins with employers and systems for reporting concerns about working conditions. The Memorial Garden still stands today, a peaceful place where wildflowers grow and visitors can reflect on the importance of treating all people with dignity and respect. It serves as a reminder that every person has value, regardless of their background or circumstances, and that the truth will always find a way to surface, no matter how deeply someone tries to bury it. During the spring and summer seasons, the garden explodes with color from flowers that were chosen to represent hope, remembrance, and renewal. During fall and winter, the evergreen trees and shrubs provide a quiet beauty that invites contemplation. Visitors often leave small memorials, flowers, stones, letters, for Michael Torres and other victims of violence. The garden has become a place where the community can come to process not just this specific tragedy, but any loss or trauma they have experienced. The story of Harold Brennan's barn has become part of local lore, told not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of the importance of justice, compassion, and the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult. It's a story about how the weight of guilt can destroy a life, but also about how truth, once revealed, can lead to healing and redemption. In the words engraved on the memorial marker, "In memory of Michael Torres and all those who work to feed our nation. May their dignity always be remembered, may their contribution always be honored, and may justice, though sometimes delayed, always prevail." The final lesson of the case is that truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's hidden or how long it remains buried. And when it emerges, it has the power to both destroy and heal, depending on how we choose to respond to it. The community of Millbrook chose healing, justice, and remembrance, transforming a tragedy into an opportunity to build something better for the future. Today, when people pass by the site where Harold Brennan's barn once stood, they see not a reminder of violence and deception, but a garden that represents hope, justice, and the fundamental dignity of all human life. It stands as a testament to the power of community to face difficult truths and emerge stronger, more compassionate, and more committed to the values that truly matter. The story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal truths about human nature, the consequences of our choices, and the importance of treating all people with the dignity and respect they deserve. It's a story about how fear and greed can lead to terrible choices, but also about how truth, justice, and compassion can ultimately prevail. In the words of Reverend O'Sullivan during a memorial service for Michael Torres, let us remember not just how Michael died, but how he lived, with hope, dignity, and love for his family, and let us work to ensure his death was not in vain, by building a community where all people are valued and protected. That is the enduring lesson of the fire that revealed everything, that truth always finds a way to emerge, and when it does, it gives us a choice about how to respond. We can choose to let it destroy us, or we can choose to use it as an opportunity to build something better. The community of Millbrook chose to build something better, and in doing so, they honored the memory of Michael Torres in a way he would have appreciated.